Hello and welcome to the PetroNerds podcast. I feel like I just did this yesterday because I just did this yesterday with Justin Kringstad. But today is Tuesday, March 1st, and I have a very special guest for you. This is episode 42 of the PetroNerds podcast, and my guest today, this has been long awaited. We've been trying to get this on the books for a while, but my guest is Matt Gallagher, who is the former CEO and executive of Parsley and as you know, a very formidable local producer in the Permian Basin that was purchased by Pioneer Natural Resources. And Matt has a lot of ventures and things he's been doing since then, which we will certainly talk about. And a lot is going on in the market, and I'm going to timestamp this in just a second with prices. But without further ado, Matt, thank you so much for coming on the podcast. I'm glad we found a time, and I really appreciate you carving out some time for this.
Yeah, Trisha, thanks for having me and followed your work. And you had me at PetroNerds, so nerd kind of got me pulled in, and I figured what better space to talk about oil and gas than with a fellow nerd. So I'm looking forward to this. Thanks for finally setting it up. It's been a scheduling challenge, and we finally did it. So here we are.
Absolutely. Well, no, thank you. That's awesome. And that's a very endearing entry point. So with that, so WTI, it is Tuesday, March 1st, 2022. I was up till 2 a.m. watching everything going on in Ukraine. And it was quite Bananaville. And Kiev has not been taken over yet, but a lot of bombings were taking place. So there's sort of that backdrop. But WTI did spike, and I think this was obviously the contracts rolling over because it's March 1st. So we weren't even close to, well, we were like 97 well below $100 last night when I went to bed. And then it spiked to 105. WTI did, and now we're at 104.28. Brent is 105.72 and nat gas is 457. And tonight we have the State of the Union from Joe Biden, the president of the United States. So I think that will be very interesting because the market is tanking. It's Dow as well, down 600 points. The only thing up is energy, and things aren't looking good. And I've been telling folks we're sort of headlong into a recession. This is before the war in Ukraine that sort of added to it, which is not something I want to make light of. It's extremely serious and quite sad. But outside of that, we were sort of headlong into a recession anyway. But oil prices being up, I'd love to tell producers to just drill, baby, drill. And I am wearing a drill bit necklace. However, I don't know how long they're going to stay up. So with that, we have a lot of ground to cover.
We do. No, it's this is unfortunately the geopolitical situation. The war on Ukraine is pulling forward a lot of realities, I think, that we haven't wanted to face for a long time. So it'll be interesting to hear what the president has to say tonight. But really, we've got to do as many things. We've got to reassess as Western powers, as Western governments, and how can we come to a short term salvo to counterpunch his energy weapon that he's using on Ukraine and really on Germany and Europe as a whole. So, the people on this podcast that like to listen to this and the people in this industry have a unique, probably obligation at this point to do what we can to message this properly for our nation and for the other nations to come to grips with a framework, a plan to counterpunch this through reliable energy production. So, and I think it can work in conjunction with some of the stated goals that this administration has had going into the energy transformation, energy renaissance that they're proposing. I think they can work together. I don't think it has to be, and I told you so, or a look back on anything. It's these are the facts on the ground now, and let's march forward as quickly as possible.
Yeah, I disagree with that the last part a bit, because I don't believe I don't have any faith in this administration in terms of energy policy. So when they have an aide today saying, "Hey, producers, you can produce more," it's a little late. And it's interesting because we actually, you reached out to me on Twitter. I think that's how we actually connected.
Mhm.
And so we were Twitter buddies a long time ago, and I don't use Twitter, I think, the way a lot of folks do. I like lots of information as opposed to snippets of information. However, this, on Twitter, you get these conversations with people, and this was several months ago, folks saying, there was people getting arguments really easily. LinkedIn, there's less sort of arguments that sort of, here's information, and people like it or dislike it. And on Twitter, it's like argument world. But there were sort of arguments. I think it was Energy Credit One was there was a pushback several months ago when I said that the U.S. could do more to actually produce more oil to signal that we could do more. And he basically said no, the market, the policymakers, and Biden couldn't do anything. And I I really struggle with that because from the beginning of this administration, from day one, and I do think it's really important to put it in context. No, they didn't do this, right? The administration didn't do what's going on, and every president gets blamed for if gas prices are high, if the economy is not doing well, they get blamed for that, right? However, you get more blamed for it when you sort of put the nail in the coffin, when you cancel Keystone XL, when you sign up
Right.
for the Paris Climate Accords, and when you enact on day one a climate change executive order. He did cancel for 2 months permits on federal land, so it wasn't as
Yep.
though, and at least you can actually, if you stay up late at night and you listen to market analysts on CNBC World, you'll get folks that come out and say this administration has had a war on fossil fuels, which I know we call that. It's crude oil, natural gas, and coal. But it's true that there is very anti-energy policy. And if you go to DC and you spend time with folks, there isn't anyone in the White House that actually truly understands hydrocarbons. So, when it comes to LNG, when it comes to permitting LNG infrastructure, at the beginning, I think there was a sense that this administration maybe was open to natural gas, as most entities were, or Europe and a lot of folks were sort of on the fence of natural gas, knowing that they need it, but they don't really know what to do with it. And that kind of got squashed, sort of middle of the road. We had a lease sale, we had a Gulf of Mexico lease sale only because it was legally obligated to by the courts. And then when that lease sale happened, it was a record lease sale because everyone knew they weren't going to be able to buy another Gulf of Mexico lease under this administration. And since then, that has been wholeheartedly squashed. There will be no more lease sales. So when yes, have oil and gas producers been able to drill holes on everything in the ground? Absolutely. Has there been any like, hey, let's permit more LNG infrastructure, let's maybe build out a pipeline out of the Marcellus, let's prevent that capacity? Absolutely not. And there's not a prayer's chance in hell it's going to happen under this administration, because that would signal a leaning into oil and gas. However, we have had the wobbling on Nord Stream 2, which is obviously done now, canceling of Keystone XL, and there's a hope, I think, and I don't know if it's going to happen, of lifting Iran sanctions, and that hope has been in play from last summer, and it keeps getting smashed down. And it's also a real problem. I mean, people may want to lift Iran sanctions now to add over 1 million barrels a day to the market, but then you have this axis, and you could call it what you want, but it's kind of an axis of evil. It's Iran, Russia, China, and North Korea, and that's not exactly a power buildup you want to be adding to right now.
No, that's too often the narrative of fossil fuels is conflated with who owns the majority of them. So I share that concern when you talk about that axis you just mentioned. You can't blame people um, for over the years associating negative connotation with oil when they're really having the negative connotation with the large sovereigns that
Absolutely.
control large pieces.
Yep.
So you have to dissect those two, and then start to demonstrate what we can provide on from a domestic or a Western standpoint. You saw Germany completely reverse course, announce two new LNG import terminals. So they need some help on the other side of who can send them that gas. I mean, that was an overnight decision. They're facing realities, and again, this is not this can work in conjunction with a long term transition for the globe. Everything in moderation. What we saw was this perfect storm of underperformance of shale companies not following everything in moderation. We had a generational
Mhm.
discovery, and then we incinerated over $1 trillion of capital. Whether you want to look at true bankruptcies or equity loss due to overproduction and over ramping it. So you didn't have the economic returns, and at the same time you had the growth of this concept of we can switch overnight into a call it a renewable future. And that's, there's neither of those are on their own the answer. We do need more investment in oil and gas for the health of humans and the planet. We're seeing, a 40 million person population being attacked because we can't counterpunch, or we can't willingly counterpunch um, without heating the rest of Europe. So, um, and then on the flip side, if we were to enact all the ambitions by 2030, we're going to emit more carbon, not less. It is a massive undertaking to deploy, EVs. I have one. I have a Ford Mustang Mach E and had it, 4 weeks now. It's a lot of fun. It's fast. I'm a car guy, so I wanted to see what the acceleration was like. B, I wanted to live with what one of these is like to live with every day and go through the trials and the tribulations. And so far, it's been easiest thing since sliced bread. To plug it into the wall. If there were no cost differences, it would fit my daily life just fine. But the fact is, there's a major cost difference. It's basically a Honda CR-V size, which is a $28,000 vehicle, and this was a $70,000 purchase. Now it's a lot faster than a Honda CR-V, so it's got that.
It is a Mustang, so you got that.
It's got that going for it. But there's a massive cost difference, and then it's being labeled as it's a huge environmental difference to the benefit, and that's not the case when these things have to get on global scale. There's lots of trade-offs that are not being talked about. So really, it comes back to consumerism, urbanization. Should we be taking 6,000 pounds of mass to 60 miles an hour in 3.5 seconds and patting ourselves on the back as doing a environmental service? No, that's impossible. That's not the case. So we have to look at things more pragmatically, and we didn't, but we didn't help our case in the last decade with our own business models. We have shifted, and in the first quarter, and I'd say the last quarter of 2021, we're starting to demonstrate what a shale business model can do. So we're taking out one of, I had the speech, the 3 Ps, pollution, profit, and perception. We're taking out one of the arguments, and that was the ability, a sustainable business model on the profit side. But again, that pendulum could have shifted too far. I think it's actually in a good spot for normal business conditions. I think over the next, 1 day to 1 month, we'll see if we're in a global situation that is outside of normal business conditions. And in a wartime situation, do we need a raise to a call? And is that separate from a business model? So this we'll watch it live as it unfolds, I guess.
Well, so all those comments are great. It's cool that you have a Mustang. I mean, I'd have preferred I'm going to take a gasoline engine over just because, and I'm one of those people that it's like there's a certain amount of percentage of the population that likes the smell of gasoline. Like
I love it too. I'll always have a gas car, that's for sure. And then I have a gas, a diesel, and electric, but I couldn't believe I couldn't do Tesla. So that was the only thing. I should love it, American innovation, but something rubs me the wrong way about that type of marketing.
There's many things, that individual. I mean, he opened a showroom in Xinjiang in China, as basically in January, just basically as a telling the Communist Party, hey, I'm here and I'm with you, in the place where you're committing human rights abuses and genocide. So I'm not really comfortable with that. But he's kind of all over the fence. I like that he's a little unique and pro energy and has come into Texas, but I think he's basically in it for himself. So I don't necessarily trust him on multiple fronts. And I don't trust folks, tech guys, especially who are leaning into the Communist Party in China. But
did you watch the first, or not the first, but I watched his live stream when we first went into the pandemic, and it was summer of 2020. And he hosted a live stream in Nevada, and all the crowd had to be in their cars in Teslas. So instead of clapping, they would honk. And I just happened to chime in, and I saw that he was pushing 300 pounds, and I've never seen one. And I was like, I want to see what this looks like. And so he's up there, and looked fine, by the way. And he was talking about his products, and he said, and we've got 10,000 acres in Nevada. We just leased it, and we're going to grab the earth. We're just going to take out our own lithium, and then we're going to put the earth back. And all the Teslas started honking, and they're cheering for open pit mining.
Yep.
The worst of what we have been pushing against. But he says it, and everybody honks and cheers for it.
Oh,
So it's just
absolutely.
fascinating.
It is. Well, it is fascinating, and I think this year, so a couple things. You make a lot of really good points, but I think that mining, we all know. I mean, anyone in the energy business, and anyone. I mean, I grew up around commodities, so coal and wheat and oil and gas, and I'm third generation oil and gas from pumpers in the family, and so everyone knows
Awesome.
that if you're gonna have an infrastructure boom, if you're gonna build out, I don't care if you're building out windmills, wind turbines, if you're installing solar panels, if you're building charging stations, you will increase emissions. If you're building crap, you're going to increase emissions because it is powered by, unless it's powered by a damn Tesla, which it's not. You're going to increase emissions, and unless your grid is 100% wind and solar, which it's not, nor could it be, or should it be, you're going to have emissions on increasing, your on the electric vehicle side. So we know that, and I really struggle with this. I think you've probably heard it in previous podcasts, and I talk about it with a lot of folks, is that I do really, really struggle now with the decarbonization effort, because unless you can prove to me you're decarbonizing, yeah, I kind of fall. It needs to be, the hole needs to be poked into it, and I get frustrated a little bit with the shale folks to this for 2021 and not just shale, but every business, and the way they've sort of leaned into ESG, and only the E, not the S or the G. They can say it, but they don't do crap. It's basically everybody's focused on their environmental stuff. And I mean, I was very disheartened that, I've always loved EOG, but EOG just said their 2040 net zero plan, and I just got, that's, it means absolutely nothing. So everybody's got their 2040, 2050 net zero plan, and we're talking about, we could put all these producers in the entire US collectively, all of them, every single oil and gas producer in the US, drop their emissions to zero for production. And I think it's 1% of US total GHG emissions. So it's a drop in the bucket, and yet everybody's killing themselves to do it. And what's really I have a problem with is that it's the output, right? So it's now, I think a lot of these operators, truthfully, did get lucky that their earnings calls came before this Russian invasion of Ukraine, because the call to sort of, we're giving all this money to back to shareholders, and we're increasing our variable dividends and special dividends and everything. That's great. And as I have a small amount of stocks, and I had a tiny little bit of cash from dividends sitting in my TD Ameritrade, and so I went ahead and bought some EOG and some Pioneer and I had never owned any of Pioneer, just not to trade. I don't trade it, just to sit in there. And I just thought, because before they popped up, and everybody was going to do their special dividends and all that stuff. But the problem I have with that is that it is not just about shareholders. You are producing a product, right? Your company is one business. It is to drill and complete wells and produce a commodity and sell it and to make money. And right now they're making tons of money on it. And that's great. I'm okay with companies being profitable. But if all of that profit is being turned back to shareholders, I am not. At some point, you're going to make more money by putting the drill bit back in the ground, because one, you're quite good at what you're doing. You have good rock from folks like EOG and Pioneer, and those, like, you have good rock. And then it comes to this point of, the market isn't. The market is calling for more crude oil, and I'm cautious to say, I'm cautious to tell everyone, go out and produce crude oil. The privates are going to do anyway, because I don't know. I don't think this is going to last that long. Geopolitics may keep oil prices up, but in terms of demand, I don't. We're sitting on the precipice here today of demand turning the corner, because this inflation and these oil prices are not sustainable. So I'm just a little bit uncomfortable with operators not paying real credence to that, and I don't like that. All of them have this pie in the sky thinking. I mean, I've been telling clients this for weeks, is that there's a very clear view in and outside the industry, but definitely with most CEOs and executives, and I'm sure you hear this, is that oil prices have one place to go and one direction, and that is north. And they basically say it's because, well, the forecasts show we're just the supply and demand. And that's what all the forecasts are showing, is that we don't have enough investment, and we have a shortfall of investment, and demand's going up, and that's the answer. Like, and I think, well, you're roughly my age, I'm guessing. So in our lifetime, we have not seen that shortfall of investment materialize. And in fact, we tend to produce when prices go up and the market's asked, the production comes out with it.
Yep. Forecasts have been wrong a time or two in the last, forever.
Forever.
So
Yeah.
you got to look at both sides, and you just mentioned, the pendulum that we're talking about, and that for a decade we were too wrong the other way. Um, and maybe there's imposed underinvestment, too wrong on the underinvestment side, and we'll have to see. But it's a healthier place to come from. I mean, we're just almost almost 24 months, I guess 22 months away from negative $37 oil pricing, and then myself lobbying something I never thought I would do before for
Right.
government to jump in. And the reason I did that at that time was I was looking at Parsley Energy's cost of capital, and we had just accessed the debt market with a really winning rate of about 4.5%. And our peers at the time were 5%. And I just looked at how far we had come as a company approaching a $10 billion enterprise company, and to get a 4.5%, we had to have hitting on all cylinders, had to have the ratings just right. And I was talking to Ann Fox at Nine Energy Services, and different vendors and suppliers to us. This was a month preceding this, and just how their cost of capital was increasing from for lack of investors, and there's no appetite for the service providers to take on new debt, and how that had to be, they're in business to be in business, so they have to run that through their models, they have to put that in their pricing, and then that comes to us. um, we didn't want to do vertical integration. Okay, why wouldn't we just own some of these companies, and then we could play our lower cost of capital and keep our costs down? No, that's gone horribly in the past for many reasons. You lose that will, that motivation to of your once you have a contract with someone, service goes down. So they're always fighting for new service to earn the service, and then it just accelerated when we saw, all these oil came down to about 40, and then it was trickling down to 30, and we saw this wave of inventory coming. And I thought, man, if oil goes in 20s, we're all going to have to shut down rigs, and the service side is going to pop, and they're never going to have access to capital again, until it's too late, and we're going to lose hundreds of thousands of jobs in Texas, and that can't be good for the state of Texas. And maybe the Railroad Commission would want to put in some stops. And at the same time, we also saw that Saudi Arabia was offering. This was when oil was $40. They were offering how much could refineries? They called the Texas Gulf Coast refineries and said, how much would you take at minus $30? This was days before they went into the price war, and then it ended up imploding. So they knew it. They knew going in they were just going to ship. So they did dump oil on our shores, and we didn't have direct proof of that. So couldn't
Well,
really.
they own the Motiva, so that they own a refinery in the Gulf, so they're able to, and they do their whatever plus or minus 10%. They never say they change the pricing, but basically each month they can go to that refinery and they can say plus or minus 10%. This is what you're taking it at, and so they were doing that stuff, previously. But yes, Mohammed bin Salman single handedly, tanked the oil market because,
Yeah. So if we were
like.
playing in a fair market, then let's play in a fair market and be
Mhm.
capitalists. But we were not in a market condition at that point in time. So that was a little bit of a digression past to the
That's
to the
fair.
past.
Hence the justification of where you stood on the Railroad Commission thing. Looking back now at that, and looking back at that, at that stance, and the only reason I say that is because, I did hear, and if you don't want to comment on this, that's totally okay. But when I hear operators dig on other operators or dig on anyone in the industry, it doesn't look really good. And I always get concerned, especially if this administration does not like oil and gas. I wholeheartedly believe that oil and gas and hydrocarbons need to be very, very careful about how they work with policymakers within this administration. But that being said, when Scott Sheffield mentioned in his earnings call, and clearly they're a little concerned about private operators, growing and increasing output. But when he mentioned that private operators need to be regulated by EPA, that's a red flag to me. One, you shouldn't want the oil and gas industry. I mean, that if you think they're going to regulate just private operators, you're outside your mind. If you open that Pandora door, like that's going to crack wide open into your business. And it was just not. It was just a kind of a mean thing to say. And absolutely, with this administration being an oil and gas producer, like what the hell? That's a EPA regulating any bit of that. Like it could be devastating for the industry, not just private operators. So I thought that that's just when you think about regulations in Colorado, they've done it, and I worked in DC. So when you want regulations to help you, you have to be careful that it sets precedent that it just keeps on going. So it's just one of those things. I was thinking about that in context of the Texas Road Commission thing of, it's in Texas is different. So you can bring it in and take it back out. But the rest of the country isn't so much. In Colorado, when the oil and gas industry was like, hey, regulate us, it never stopped. And now you can't get a permit in Colorado.
And that was, I'll just jump back to the proration. And I think that was the biggest slippery slope and some input I took, making calls around, who agrees, who doesn't agree. Actually, at that point, most of the small guys, more so than Parsley Energy, were for it. I mean, we were healthily hedged. There was nothing particularly in it for Parsley aside from I'll double down on this. I mean, when you're in a unusual non-market condition, there should be boundary conditions and a framework. And I think it played out exactly as I was concerned about it. And if we could have stemmed the negative 37 oil, if it would have landed at 10, just think of the insurance actuary business. Yep. I mean, it's happened now, negative 37. So yep. When you're putting on a hedge position, you have to calculate what if, and now you can go to that. So it's driven a huge amount of cost, kind of this silent hand of cost throughout the system. What happened to the service providers was as feared. And now, of course, pricing is back for them, but they just don't have the staff and the labor. There are people that just don't want to come back into this industry. The delta of our pricing is not as large as it used to be in 2011 to 14 to an Amazon warehouse, Amazon driver, when we're talking about truckers, et cetera. So I really viewed it, and probably naively so, or maybe naively so, as a non-market condition with a point in time. And the regulatory bodies or the framework in Texas and the pro business attitude in Texas, I thought would have been able to put a condition together that unwinds itself. That's naive because I'm not a politician. And once someone tastes a little bit of power, they maybe keep it and never relinquish it. And as you're seeing, but in Colorado and others, but I think that's more to do with their bias towards. They're not biased towards business. They're biased towards other drivers there. So. It's a challenge.
Those are all fair points, though, and I appreciate the retrospective look and the honesty there, because I don't know what I would have done in that situation. I know that you guys and Pioneer were in favor, and I know that Exxon and Diamondback were against it, and Exxon and Diamondback sort of threatened because they did have the largest rig count. And when you look back now at it and you look at the devastation of the rig count, and I think this comment on the service providers, because I get I work with a lot of service companies, honestly, and I actually love working with them. I love working with all companies, and E&Ps included, is that because service providers, I can actually move the needle for them. It's public, private, small guys, I can, because they tend to be extremely reactive. They spool up and they spool down, and I want them to have as much knowledge about the market and as possible, so that they can, I know who they're targeting, why they're targeting them, what's important about that. And it's like, well, it doesn't matter which depth they're drilling at. It does. I love that. I want to tell you which depth they're drilling. I want to tell you why they're targeting that formation. I want to say, do they have longevity in this? Is this a short? Are they going to do this for 2 months and leave? Or are they going to come back and be there for a long long time. And, permits and all this stuff matters with that. Simple data that you can make really talk.
Hmm.
All that being said, these service companies make me really, I get anxious a lot because they do spool up really fast and they spool down, and you hear things like, well, we don't have enough service providers, and or other service providers making money. And I put a line in one of my presentations I gave to a client, and I know that client spit it back and said that line was great. And it was that I get a lot of phone calls from service companies that I'm trying to work with, or cold calls, and I hear a lot about the ESG side, the green energy. And I mean, it gives me almost nearly a heart attack because this is a business that a lot of companies are barely making money in the business that they're in. They're not actually profitable in the business that they're in, which is oil and gas. And now they're trying to pivot into like green tech. And I'm like, where, what is the green? I mean, it's completely off the wall. They don't even know what the green tech is. They just have this, fear and this understanding, and they're a year late, right? Everybody sort of leaned in at the beginning of January and February last year, and even then, you're kind of it just on a whim. But it was sort of this concept to me of just this moving quickly and sort
Hmm.
of chasing and not actually being profitable. But right now, the service side is that the real question is, look, if oil prices are $100 a barrel and these companies are not profitable, when will they ever be? And I always tell people, the service company, like the oil and gas business, it evolves, and this is not how the service sector will look 5 years. I mean, it cannot look this way 5 years from now, because to your point before, I mean, service companies were making money, in 2014, but
Yep.
their structures were different, right? They were selling, sand and fluids and chemicals were all sort of included in the package, and now that's all separate, and those are all outside of it, and those work with the operator. So I think that aspect of how people don't really appreciate how the service side evolved, and it is nimble, it is really fast, it is flexible, but they also haven't been able to raise their rates in tandem with these prices.
Right.
And that is something that a lot of operators have not really explained clearly, of course, on their earnings calls, of just that, hey, well, we haven't seen these massive price increases by, the service guys, which they're going to have to see. And I'm not saying anybody needs to gouge, but you heard it in service earnings calls of the inflation that they're seeing. I mean, energy feels energy prices. I mean, diesel prices are up, nat gas prices are up. Like, so all these components are up, and eventually you have to get to a point where you don't want these service providers to go under either. You need these guys to be making enough money to where they have a stable business, and yes, you can weather the storms together, you can sort of move down together, and you can move back up. And, it can't be just one entity taking all the chunk of the pie.
Well, I agree with you 100%. And it goes back to smoothing off the peaks and valleys. When you're at
Absolutely.
the absolute base, do you put your foot on a vendor, or do you treat them as a partner and say, hey, I have three other vendors that are looking to keep their doors open. What is it going to take to keep your doors open? And I've seen in my career, even in individual business units within the company, and the leaders take different approach, and you have to constantly sit them down and talk about, hey, hold on, this is going to swing the other way. And then now we're approaching a peak, the lag of investment, and now they have to reactivate on the pricing side. um, those people that you smooth the valleys with, they're going to smooth the peaks too. Also, they're going to find other ways to get that top dollar rate, on their margin, on their fringe clients. um, so if you can have a little longer term view, it's just very, very challenging in this industry. We also did a little bit of vertical integration. We bought a rig company, had 8 rigs. We converted it into 2 horizontal rigs. But the labor component of that, at the time, it was, roughly, in 2014, we were getting quoted $28,000 a day rig. And those rigs were 3 gen sets, 5,000 pound pressure top ends. They were set up probably for, a 2 mile well was a stretch for them, horizontal well. And they were asking $28,000 a day, and the labor component of that was probably 14,000 a day, or their cost on that. You fast forward to today, the current rig rates, or I say current, coming into the year, were somewhere in the 19 to $22,000 a day rate. But their labor and their expense component was probably $16 to $17,000 a day, because the rigs are more robust. They have 4 gen sets. There's more depreciation on this stuff, so their margins were squeezed. So now they're trying to ask in that $28,000 day rate, and they're still getting a ton of pushback. So it's a good example to agree with you that versus 2014, the day rates aren't even back on the drilling side. But it also comes back to policy. And when I'm trying to say think of things longer term, you need a little bit of certainty, and all those measures. As much as I want to be constructive with anybody I do business with, both political side, how do we come to a solution? How do we win here together? What are your big concerns? Okay, carbon emissions. Well, let's look at, are you talking about in one state, or are you talking about across the globe? Because everything that we produce, it helps mitigate about 15 tons per CO2 or per barrel equivalent from somewhere else that is produced. So, or are you going after something else? But those early policy uncertainties, shutting down for really arbitrary reasons, um, pipelines as an example, no federal permits as another example. Even though it was 2 months and they got back on the
Yeah.
trolley, that drives uncertainty. And when you're trying to build partnerships with a vendor network, and let's say a frac company needs to go out and sign a long-term contract for their fluid end replacements with a small fabrication shop in North Houston, and that company needs to hire people for 2 years. It all has impact. So you need to drive a stable environment. And we're really getting outside of that with our policy. We're trying to drive um, outcomes through policy instead of making frameworks for market conditions. And it's so I do agree with you that we need to reboot on that approach for sure.
Well, and I think that just means that, and I always come at from, if you know you're explaining just, I mean, how business works, and I always tell people that business flourishes in certainty and predictability. I mean, so when you add unpredictability, and that's what was really frustrating about at the beginning of this administration, when most people didn't even know it, but it was this piece of paper, this from the Secretary of or acting Secretary of Interior, this piece of paper with a stamp on it that just said it included these permits. It was poorly written. I think it was actually technically illegal, and yet it was done. And actually, we've had lots of things with the Senate administration and other ones that have been illegal and then pushed back in court. But that really impacts business. And so I think that people don't realize that you have to have this stability and predictability for business to thrive and to flourish. And if you want to look at sort of what not to do, or yes, you can talk the talk about reducing, basically nobody wants to have oil and gas anymore in the world. So they focus on, policing, from the regulatory side, but not doing anything about the actual demand side. And I don't want them to, frankly, to do anything about the demand side. But the reality is they get into a situation where in the UK and Europe, where they have production has declined massively for gas production, and yet their consumption has not declined in tandem over the past 10 years. And they get to where they have this big gap, and those imports are coming from Russia and other places, and they're in the position that they're in. And you mentioned too before, I mean, there's two things I wanted to rewind back on. That was, you did mention in Europe, the reversing policy. And I think it was, and I tried to recap this yesterday when I was talking with Justin, but the chancellor, a new chancellor of Germany, did give a speech 2 days ago, and it was a 30-minute speech. And I mean, within that speech, this was a wartime speech talking about how they are adding money, how they're increasing immediate funding to military efforts, for one. Two, that they were putting 2% of their GDP going forward to military spending. They were finally going to be hitting their native requirements, because they hadn't been. And then lastly, that on energy, and they said, yes, we want to continue to pursue renewable energy because we want renewable energy to help us to get off dependence from Russia. But also, they were going to, as you pointed out, they're going to be investing in natural gas imports and natural gas storage. They didn't mention coal, which they are thinking about not reducing as quickly, and nuclear within that speech. But those are also on the table. So the reality is that when you push too hard on something, or you have to, even if you do something, the world around you changes, and you have to be flexible and adaptable to that. And the oil and gas, I think, is included in that. And in addition to that, the minus 37 oil, I think, to me, is still fascinating, because I believe that the CME group, I don't think it was supposed to technically go negative. I don't think it was allowed to go negative. And then they basically changed the rules the weekend before to let the contracts go negative. Okay, sorry folks, we had a bit of a technical difficulties there. So if there's a disconnect in the conversation, that's real, because I was talking to myself, and I don't know where Matt was on that he was disconnected, so we're bringing this back together.
We got reconnected, and we were joking that it was the Russians attacking us after I challenged them in a tweet that I said, hey, we're trying to replace your imports, which is unbelievable that we're importing from Russia. It should stop immediately here in the U.S. But yeah, we had to up our website's denial of service defenses after that. So after that tweet.
Yeah, so we were just saying, I think it's in total, it has increased actually over the last year considerably, but it's still about 500,000 barrels a day total between products and crude that we import from Russia. So we were both saying that we can bounce this out pretty quickly. There are things that, as the U.S. shale industry, this should be a, hey, can you produce that? We 100% can, and I'm pretty damn sure that we can get the refineries to run a little bit hotter, and bounce out that product as well, so that we can just full stop, no more Russian crude oil.
And that's a great idea, where it should be set, in this little bucket of, hey, this is a wartime response, and it's happening under these conditions immediately. And I think between all the operators, that should be an easy call to have happen.
Yeah, and I think we haven't talked about recession risk, which I keep mentioning, and I think it's very serious. So I want to touch on that. But when you were saying the minus 37 before, and I'm not sure where in the lag of the podcasting lag, I was mentioning that I don't think minus 37. So when oil prices went negative, I remember watching it, as we all were probably watching it, going, is it going negative? It's going negative. And I don't think it was supposed to do that. Like, I don't think the CME group basically changed the rules the weekend before, allowing the contract to go negative. And to me, that was another BS kind of illegal thing. I think there was only 6 million barrels in total that got caught up in that, sort of stuck at minus 37. So yes, 6 million barrels, the folks that on that end lost money. However, it just kind of was annoying because people really fixated on it. The market did, and it jaded the market. And it certainly, when people talk about the shortfall of investment now, in air quotes, minus 37 was certainly a component of that, of like everybody was just scared. It drives me crazy though, because, and I start all my presentations now with this picture of myself on a tank battery, because I always say I grew up around this business, and I just want to keep everybody focused on this. Okay.
That's right.
This is a boom and bust business. Yeah. When it is booming, nobody thinks it's going to bust again. And when it is busting, nobody thinks it's going to boom again. And right now we're sitting at $104 oil. And if you feel comfortable here, you shouldn't. Yeah. This is not a comfortable place to be in. Prices are too high. The market's tanking. This is, we have very high inflation. We have very high oil prices. And I'm going to about put a chart on LinkedIn and tweet it, is that oil prices and housing prices, oil demand and housing prices in the U.S. move in perfect lockstep. You can chart them, put them on a chart, and put oil demand goes up, housing prices go up. And when housing prices come down, so does oil demand. And our average home prices in the U.S. are $500,000. The average home price in the U.S. and the average mortgage is nearing $500,000. We're at banana levels we're at way pre-2008, 2007 levels for this type of stuff. We added $1 trillion in debt, just household debt, in 2021 alone. So in nominal terms, it was the highest rate of debt increase since 2007. And so, we're just at this sort of level where this isn't good.
And no, there's a lot of funny money pumping through the system. The one bullish point I have, or just frame of reference or context, is we get fixated on $100 a barrel oil. Now, granted, there's really unique conditions driving this right now, but that's just a number, just like the negative 37 happened, and it's a number, but that is equivalent. It's much more bearable today than it was in 2007 and 2008. Household incomes have grown, savings have actually increased per household. So, and we didn't see demand destruction until you went into the recession. It wasn't the $130 and $140 oil early 2007 that was causing demand destruction. So I find that interesting. It is bearable, that is not going to pop the economy. $100
But it
oil.
was your leading. It's sort of, so when you stack all these up, it's your leading indicator. I mean, GDP and the current account deficit. There's some leading indicators that lead you into this. And so when you look at oil demand, and I do think it's important because the U.S. is a transparent market, right? And there's a million topics we're not hitting on, but when people look at oil demand, I always tell folks it's look back for the global oil demand. You're constantly looking back and you're revising the data, and that's what happened. The IEA just revised their data for 2019 and
I
2020.
think what the IEA
And
doing is criminal with their
what's it?
with their 2030 forecast. It's literally putting countries at risk, and they're not showing. And I actually talked to a German reporter about a month ago, and she said that her son, when that she lives in New York, and she said
Mhm.
that when they shifted from an oil boiler system for heat to natural gas, her son moved out of the house for about a month. He was so upset at them for being a traitor and not not doing their part. And she said, "Well, we need to heat the home during the winter. We can't put solar panels." That's what he was arguing for. And now this was a month ago, and they were experiencing the high pricing in Germany. And she just said, "I said, what's the sentiment like over there?" And she said, "A decade ago, we just feel like we weren't told the whole story, and we still feel like we're leading on a lot of fronts, but we weren't told the consequences." And that the way that the IEA is promoting, this. I talked to someone who believed that in 2030, oil demand was going to be 30 million barrels a day, and that's how they're running their business and their
Mm,
investments around it. And
yeah,
that's disingenuous. It's dangerous, and countries are being run that way, and
absolutely.
we're seeing
And
the implications.
so I'll point out here today, you were one of the first people and industry leaders, I would say, that agrees with. I say it is 100% criminal what Fatih Birol and the IEA have done, and he needs to be called out for it. And what his goals are, I don't know if he's running for office or what he's doing, but what the international people need to start asking where they're getting their money, what has happened to them, because they're part of releasing right now. They're doing a coordinated strategic release of 60 million
Yeah.
barrels a day of oil, and so their job is supposed to be about oil, right? And no, they're now focused on this the net zero 2050, which was a thought piece, which turned into his best work ever, which is now turned into everything on their website is IE net 2050. And if you look at those charts on 2030, I don't know if people have seen it on by 2030 or 2040, because now it's the 2050 scenario, but they fast forward the charts to 2030 and 2040. We have to reduce natural gas demand globally by 60% by like 2030 from today's levels. And you literally can't, the only thing that's going to save this world, including with emissions, is natural
Yeah.
gas. I mean, to just go forward for anything. So it's banana world. And I always tell people, 2 years ago when I was going through this, I was telling folks, and my clients, it will bankrupt countries. Like their scenarios and the cost, by the way, the new estimates from the International Renewable Energy Agency, which a lot of folks also say they're criminal, is 146 trillion. And I'm hearing numbers of almost like 200 trillion. These are bananaville figures of what it's going to cost to just to get us all renewable. And the perfect example is like, I think Germany is a great example in terms of what's happening. And I think Terry Bros, the podcast that just dropped this week, if you haven't listened to
Mm.
it, it's awesome because it's all European energy policy. And he goes into the magic math that he air quotes magic math that the regulators have, and I met him on a panel I did at the beginning of this month with the Global Gas Center. And my panel that I was moderating was the European energy crisis. And I had a German utility provider on the panel. And I said, hey, I just don't buy that y'all are okay with spending the average consumer is okay with having the highest electricity prices in the world. And he says, I think we are. And I was like, well, you might think that. And I kind of think that sometimes when I talk to CEOs, if they're like, well, I'm okay at these price levels, I'm like, okay, of course you are. You're making crap loads of money. Other people can't handle this inflation, these oil prices. And I think these German utility providers, they keep saying this of like, this is fine, we're going to do this. Well, one of the guys showed his chart, and he shows, and it's on this webinar, you can look at it, but he shows his chart and he says, this is what we're supposed to hit. All of our emissions and everything. We can't do it. We probably won't hit this because it's just not going to happen. And in Colorado, I just heard something yesterday was that it's people want to get rid of natural gas in homes. They want to get natural gas in small engines. I think there's actually a bill to try to get rid of natural gas in generators, into lawnmowers, into everything, that would be gasoline. But the cost to actually convert a home to fully electric is 30 grand. So to basically get out all your natural gas and everything, it's 30 grand. So you're talking like tens of billions of dollars if you were to actually do this. I mean, the numbers are insane. The efficiency is insane. And heat pumps, which everyone, if you listen to Columbia University and all these stuff, when they talk about like, oh, we can just convert this over to heat pumps, they're not efficient and they don't work at low temperatures.
Well, we're addressing things. Well, first of all, I think we would both be in favor of everything in moderation, everywhere we can, making improvements, in our own operations, doing things with less emissions. So it's really hard to get caught in this trap of sounding like you're not supportive of all that, but talking reality at the same time. But we're fortunate in our lives that we are disconnected from billions of people on this planet and their plight and their goals. And another podcast I recently listened to, it's by Barry Weiss, but she interviewed a guy, Rob Henderson, and it's called Luxury Beliefs, and it's about this disconnection and saying things that may sound good but really hurt the masses. But the people that are saying these things have not had to come up through. They have not had to live with what they're preaching.
Right.
So it's and that's what we're talking about here. It's these things have major consequences on the price of a tortilla. What we're seeing in wheat prices right now, and corn, obviously with what's going on in Ukraine. I had no idea that they had such a large. I grew up in Indiana, so I was a homer. Okay, we're back. So what I was most surprised about was corn and wheat, and I grew up in Indiana, in the oil field, but plenty of corn around, so a little bit of a homer when it came to corn, and I couldn't believe the global impact that Ukraine has on corn. So those types of things, the inflationary on our food, and these RINs and the ethanol mandates are driving up the cost of food as well. So the policymakers just aren't as connected with Joe Public.
Renewable identification number. You really have to be like a corn person and an ethanol person to really understand. I don't know if somebody's dropped RIN on this podcast, maybe except for myself. Yep. So yeah, previous life when I studied ethanol and RINs, but yeah. Great little anecdote. And I grew up commodities as well, and didn't know your Indiana corn boy, but my grandfather on my mom's side was a wheat farmer. And so I grew up around that my whole life. And then, I had a lot of relatives working at the coal mines, which will be shut down within years now, and the power plant. And then, my dad pumped oil wells, my grandpa pumped oil wells. And so fortunate in a lot of ways to really, really actually understand commodities, and wasn't raised with money. So, I mean, we did work for everything we got, and very strong work ethic, and wouldn't change it for anything. But there's a difference in understanding that, of like where stuff comes from and how, what the cost of it is. And, if the wheat was too wet, and taking it to get sold, and not, getting crappy prices because you're in the middle of nowhere. It's dry land wheat farming, and you got mountains around you and lava rocks. And I mean, you're barely going to break even. And then of course oil prices are up, and that's great for my dad, but it's bad for my grandpa. I mean, it was just something. Yep. You grow up knowing this stuff. And I do think there's something about I was driving my German Shepherd, and I'm driving my F-150 back to my house Sunday. And I was thinking about, all the stuff with watching people and their families in Ukraine pack their lives into a backpack, and folks today, they have women on BBC talking about, they're worried about escaping to get their kids, chemo treatment, because they got all these cancer patients, these children. And so this is nothing, we have very little to worry about, sort of in the standpoint that we're in, and we are in an advantageous position to think about this. But that all being said, this thing about the recession risk and oil production, and we talk about these leading indicators, but these grain prices we are seeing these high prices, not just across every single indicator for inflation in the U.S. And I point out that between 2019 and 2021. there were only two countries that had a higher rate of inflation than the US in the entire world, and that was Turkey and Brazil. And that is not a category, those are not categories you want to fall into. So we had major inflation in the US. And we've, just now, I think, really seeing it in terms of, your electric bills and everything, and you're going to the grocery store, you're hitting at the gas pump. I am absolutely seeing it. I'm feeling it. And I think the reality is that we could see things could be curbing pretty quickly in the US. And I always point that out because the US is actually where you can see, I mean, the paper contract for the NYMEX settles in Cushing, Oklahoma. Like, we have a transparent oil market in the US. We know weekly demand levels in the US. We know where crude oil is at. So yes, you might not know the whole world perfectly, but you do know where crude oil demand sits in the US. And so when you look at the recession in 2008, we did lead the world. I mean, the world was shy of, didn't even drop 2 million barrels a day of demand, but the U.S. led that with well over a 2 million barrel a day demand drop in crude oil. And that wasn't necessarily because of we had $140 oil. That was a component to it. It was because we had a recession. And usually all
Yep.
these things sort of move up together, right? High prices for everything, inflationary increases, and then you have something that curbs this, and a war, and central runs on central bank, everything. We're in that territory. Wars can do that. And I would say now it's just that this administration's in a really hard spot with this massive inflation. But the U.S. consumer, I don't think looks as good as people think. Savings are sort of edging down. Inflation is eating into this, and and these high oil prices in tandem with high everything prices and those housing statistics I gave you, it doesn't look very good right now. It actually looks
Well,
scary.
we should also, it does. There's a lot weighing on people, and now you add this uncertainty that affects the psyche, and the markets are psychology. That's what it is. Are we feeling good about things or not? And doesn't feel too good. Look, talking about those kids being evacuated and trying to get cancer treatment, that has to impact things. I think we should take a separate bet. Do we think today's Tuesday, March 1st? Do we think a week from today, Tuesday, March 8th, there'll be an Iranian deal? I think there will be.
Um, Yeah, I think there will be. If I'm a and I am a betting person, I think there will be because there has to be. In truth, I don't think it's good. I'm concerned that it's a
Yeah,
very bad.
it's another example. It's another example of we got ourselves backed into this corner, and now we're doing everything but the practical stuff that we should have been doing. But
Right. So
here
I
we
I
are.
think, but you know what? They've been trying for over a year. So the reality I just want to paint to that is that they've been trying for this for
Hmm.
since last summer, and this administration has absolutely wanted to, because it would have given them a lot of cover actually to, you could impact U.S. output in the and it's sort of opposite of what Obama did, right? Where they could sanction these because the U.S. was producing so much crude oil, they
Hmm.
could actually, you had a lot of maneuverability on the geopolitical side. Opposite is the U.S. administration could impact oil and gas production in the U.S. if the globe is producing it, which is what they've been very sort of clear that that's what they want to do. Psaki has said that in press conferences, is that they can sort of impact global output or rely on global output and impact at U.S. here. So I think that they've wanted to do that, and it hasn't happened because Iran is not quite playing ball, and we have very hardline leadership in Iran. So I think it may happen. So if I'm betting with you, I'd agree it's probably going to happen because I think they're in a rock and a hard spot, and the world desperately needs another million barrels a day output. However, I think it is a bad call. And if we already are in trouble with a very strong China-Russia alliance that the market is not paying attention to that. In addition to the recession stuff, I'm very worried about. I am very seriously worried about, there's 146 billion in trade, that almost 147 billion in trade between China and Russia that takes place, and the market's been really naive to say, well, China just doesn't know what's going on, and I don't think they really want this. And they may not want war in Ukraine for sure, but if you don't think they knew about it, I mean, literally Putin and Xi Jinping just spoke on the phone days after the invasion happened. So there's a direct line of communication. They absolutely know what's going on, and
They waited till after the Olympics.
exactly, and they've
Okay.
coordinated this, and the big deal that they signed. BBC actually does a really good job with their real story. They do like a 1 hour dive on these things, and they just did one on China and Russia. And there's a woman on it, Bonnie Lin, who works at CSIS, and she was talking about that big agreement that they signed. And even sometimes she's a little bit more like, this isn't such a big deal, but that huge agreement that they signed, and as people know, I spend a lot of time on working on the China stuff. it is really significant. It's a very, very historical document. There's a lot of meat to it. So I don't think if folks think the end goal is Ukraine, I think they're miscalculating
Well, it's
because
also, I agree. And it's, we kind of say, or I've said, that Germany has gotten themselves dependent on Russia and XYZ. But what are we doing with China? I mean, we love $5 t-shirts. We are so dependent on China. The COVID test I took, they're made in China. This is 2 years into the pandemic where we were worried about our supply chain, and the tests we're taking are made in China. And I don't know how we say we have leverage against them unless we want to greatly affect our way of life. So if they ever decide to align um, more overtly with Russia or do something negative, I don't know our repercussions without greatly affecting our way of life. So maybe we need to start, diversifying some supply chain more proactively here because it's not pretty.
well, and that's why I'm really, really big on the climate change piece, because I don't think people appreciate that how nefarious China's role in promoting climate change is. And so it's great when you're promoting a problem, you're contributing to the problem, and then you're selling the solution. So
Yes.
and China is very, very close with Europe. And so it's a piece that's not highly looked at, that if you look at the trade relationships and the inability for Europe to push back on China, it's significant. And partly that's because Europe is so hell bent on climate change, and that's because and they're buying a lot of wind and a lot of solar from China. And so you can't criticize, China and Xinjiang without having, your hand slapped and getting repercussions. And China has done a very, very good job in making clear, if you say anything against them, if you're Australia and you say, hey, we want to look into the origins of the COVID crisis, you will no longer, your wine will be banned and your coal will be banned, and damn the costs, and that's what happens. And so Europe's very much in that spot, and now Europe is extremely preoccupied with this war in Ukraine. So if people haven't noticed, you're hearing very little on China. They had a property sector that's backsliding, and these property developers are going under left, right, and center, but no one's talking about it because we're very squarely focused on Ukraine. I'm not saying this has gone the way Putin has thought it would go. So it seems like that their casualties have been higher. War never goes the way you exactly plan, but if you don't think this was coordinated, and if you don't think that there's an incentive for these two countries to be sort of working together, it's huge. But the climate change thing really does drive me. It really does drive me batty. And that's why I harp on, when you say you're decarbonizing, show me the numbers and show me how it works out globally, because China has an incentive to make sure they're selling you those wind panels and the solar, I'm sorry, the wind turbines and the solar panels, which are made from forced labor in Xinjiang. And I'm very, very uncomfortable with that. And so if you want to build it, build it here, build it and get it from Canada, get it from a developed country where you know where that supply chain is coming from. But there's no excuse to get it from China. So t-shirts, yes, those are also made in Xinjiang. That's not great either. So yeah, separating yourself from China is huge, but it's one of the many, many serious issues in this long laundry list of issues.
Oh, we got a lot of work to do, don't we?
We do. And I know you need to run. I probably need to run too. But before we wrap this up, I don't think folks know what I'd love, you've probably talked about this in other podcasts, but your new company is called Greenlake Energy Ventures, correct?
Yes.
Yeah.
Greenlake Energy Ventures. So we sold Parsley, merged it into Pioneer. It was a very tough kind of emotional process for me because strategically I was in agreement. I thought this is an amazing thing for the shareholder. But here I am 2 years into a young person with the opportunity to be a CEO of an amazing company. We had a great culture, knew almost every employee, got up over 500 employees. It was just a super rewarding thing to be a part of. And I knew what that impacts on the other side. So I didn't know what the next was going to look like. So I was kind of twirling my thumbs for family reasons. Just could not, we had a decade sprint of 24/7, could not go back in immediately could not go back into the public world. So what is this going to look like? Well, here in Austin, there's Lake Austin, and you can see it from the back patio of our house. And had a 5-year-old, 7-year-old boy, and in the mornings during the pandemic, we'd walk back there, and during the week, it's just calm as could be, and it has a green hue to it, so they would call it Greenlake. And then we were brainstorming on company names, and we didn't even know what the company exactly was going to do. We knew we were going to drill wells, or I knew I was going to drill wells. My boys didn't, but so we Greenlake kind of one of the boys helped come up with that name, so that was a lot of fun. We live in the Westlake area of Austin, and we didn't want to. Okay, Westlake, Northgate, how Bridgeview, how do you get there? And that's where Greenlake landed from. And then so we spooled together a couple of acres in the Delaware Basin. It was just a few of us at the beginning, and in early 21, and then started getting some traction and picked up close to 5,000 acres. So we have 14 people here at Greenlake, and stood up an H&P rig, and we're off and running. So it's a lot of fun. But then there's another arm within Greenlake Technology Ventures, and we're making investments in kind of tangential support software to the industry. So our data lake that we're using, we're invested with the company that's building that out, and we don't even have a server, and I have more computing power at our house than we do in this office, and everything is remote, everything's cloud, and we're just trying to build from a clean slate platform, and looking for some solutions there, looking to invest actually on the ESG front, but on the technology front. So the shovels and the things that can enable some of this. That's what we're working on. So on the website, I do have a center tile that says renewables. At the beginning, a year ago, I was looking at some renewables. The more I tried to understand it, the more I realized I don't understand it, with the tax equity dollars and all of that. And these were single digit returns, so I wasn't able to make any investments. So at some point I need to remove that tile, but for sure in the support side on the batteries and the technological front, doing some investments over there. So it's been a busy year, but it's been a good new, I think, for us.
That's awesome. That's really awesome, and I appreciate giving that explanation, because I think there was when I first talked to Matt, we were talking about there was this Twitter storm of people texting me of like, "What's he doing now?" And he's doing all this green stuff, and I'm like, I don't think that's what the company is. I mean, it was like, I don't think that's what the company is. And then you were telling me you were drilling. So one, I do think you did have a fantastic reputation. So I didn't know you back then, but I knew that what I heard was great, of that if you want to meet a young leader in the space that really knows what they're doing and has a team behind him, that's I only heard positive things from Parsley. So it wasn't surprising to me that you were able to, wrangle up the money and be able to drill some wells. So I think that's awesome, and wish you guys a lot of success. I would love to, help out anywhere I possibly can. And separate from that, we also talked about when we first talked on the phone, we were talking about like responsibly sourcing barrels.
Yes.
And I was thinking about this ESG component, which I think is so relevant now. And I've been thinking about this and talking about this for sort of 10 years of that. I know where my barrel in Canada comes from. I know where my barrel in the US comes from. I know that it's not produced with forced labor. I know if I'm flaring, I know the methane, everything. And so, there's more things we can do here in the US on methane reductions, on everything. But in terms of, humanely sourcing a barrel of crude oil, also, keeping the revenue in the US, not exporting it to not exporting it, giving the money to Iran, giving the money to Russia, giving the money to, unstable dictatorships in Africa. I mean, this is really quite serious. And I think it's a big deal that, a recognition we consume. This is still a roughly 100 million barrel day production and supply global market. And so sustainably sourcing these barrels, which we absolutely do in the US, is just an important aspect of this business.
Absolutely. And I think, there's absolutely a market for it too. I saw on a weekly data that we used 23 million barrels in the US, which is actually quite scary when you look at the projections. Yep. But let's say that there's a market for 5 million or so of those to be people are buying organic milk, and I do as well. So there's a market for a premium product, and we have a premium product. So
oil is totally organic, by the way.
Totally organic. You can't beat that. So So yeah, I think we should sell our organic oil.
Yeah, organic, sustainably sourced, homegrown.
Yep.
Yeah, is it local?
Gluten
It's like
free.
local sand. Correct sand. Yeah, gluten free.
Yep.
It's great. All right, well, we could go on a number of tangents, but I really want to thank you for joining me on the podcast. I'll have to have you back because I'm sure we barely like scratched the
This was a lot of
surface on.
fun.
Yeah, absolute ton of fun. Fantastic guest. Hope the listeners think so as well. But thank you so much, and we'll talk soon.
All right, Trisha, thanks a lot.